As 1859 began, it looked as if the groundwork for a lasting peace was being laid in North Taranaki. The Puketapu Hapu were resolving their differences, with the land at the heart of their dispute being sold and compensation being paid to the family of Raruri, whose murder had triggered the 4-year-long feud. Ihaya of the Otarawa Hapu had effectively been exiled to the north, where he could no longer easily cause trouble for the rest of Te Atiawa. However, the European settlement of New Plymouth was not inclined towards peace. Over the past 4 years, many of the settlers had come to believe that Ihaya was their ally, and that they should be supporting him against his enemies, in particular Wiramukingi. Gore Brown, the governor of the colony, seems to have agreed with this position. He had not been able to come to Ihaya's aid in 1858 because Ihaya was responsible for the brutal murder of Katatore, but this did not stop him from making preparations for a future conflict. On the 1st of January, the people of Puketapu were receiving payment for their land, but at the same time Gore Brown issued a proclamation founding the Taranaki Volunteer Rifles. This was a semi-professional military force and the first of its kind in New Zealand. Previously, the defence of the colony was split between professional British soldiers and local settlers acting as militia in defence of their own settlements. These 100 volunteers and 3 officers were able to go on offensive operations alongside or independent of the British troops, and would be partially trained. The proclamation specified that there was to be no more than 42 hours of training per year, so semi-professional is an accurate description. In February, Wiramukingi wrote to Donald Maclean following a meeting of his Runanga regarding the sale of land. The Runanga had set a boundary inside which no land sales would be accepted. The boundary covered almost all of the land remaining to Te Atiawa, everything between Mokau and a point just beyond the Wainona stream, basically where the New Plymouth Airport is currently located. This letter went on to explain why they wished to retain their land. These lands will not be given by us into the governor's and yours hands, lest we resemble the seabirds which perch upon a rock. When the tide flows, the rock is covered by the sea, and the birds take flight, for they have no resting place. Gore Brown did not immediately reply to Kingi. Instead, on the 6th of March, Gore Brown arrived in New Plymouth aboard a 26-gun frigate. The frigate fired its guns in salute as Gore Brown disembarked, and he received another salute from the Royal Artillery as he landed on shore, where he was met by a guard of honour. This was probably a deliberate show of military might of the government. Gore Brown was met by deputations of settlers, informing him that the settlement desperately needed more land. Their pasturages in particular were overstocked. The initial wheatland was tired, and the newly purchased forest sections were difficult to grow wheat in. They also strongly urged the governor to act against Henare Te Whare, who continued to occupy a significant portion of land. Gore Brown sympathised with the settlers and said that their concerns were his concerns as well, but that he couldn't force a land sale through against majority opposition of the landowners. 2 days later, the main event of Gore Brown's trip occurred. In a paddock beside Robert Parris's house, he met with around 160 Maori from Te Atiawa to explain the government's future position on land sales in this province. The meeting began with some Maori asking for an extension of English law to their own hapu. Donald Maclean, speaking on behalf of the government, responded saying that English law was only for those districts where the people are wise enough to desire it and prepared to carry it into effect themselves. Further, Ngāpuhi and Northland had done so, and it looked like they would have a very prosperous future as a result. Maclean turned to Gore Brown's position on violence. He stated that the governor would have arrested Katatore after Raluri's murder, should he have been the governor at the time. And although he hadn't arrested Ihaya after the murder of Katatore, from now on any violence in the European districts would result in arrest and trial. Maclean then spoke on the central issue, land sales and the government's position. The government would now be looking at individual land holdings, not collective ones, but that he would never consent to buy land without an undisputed title. He would not permit anyone to interfere in the sale of land unless he owned part of it, and, on the other hand, he would buy no man's land without his consent. This seems to have been a direct response to the Runanga's letter of the previous month, and rejected the power of the Runanga to prevent land purchases within the iwi's territory. A short time later, Te Teira Manuka rose to speak and offered to sell land at Waitara to the governor. From the European perspective, Waitara was the most valuable land that Te Atiawa held, and was also the largest Te Atiawa settlement in Taranaki. Te Teira was initially unopposed, and Gore Brown and Maclean agreed to buy this land on the spot. Te Teira placed a parawai, a fine form of cloak at Gore Brown's feet to symbolise that the land was under the governor's protection, and sat back down. Another man then rose and offered to sell land to the east of Waitara, but was shouted down. A third man tried to add his land to Te Teila's offer, but Te Teila blocked him from doing so, probably because it would add confusion to the transaction. Then another man spoke, arguing that Te Teila could not sell the land without the consent of himself and another, since they both had claims to a portion of it. Wiramukingi then took the opportunity to speak and reiterated the position of the February runanga. Listen, Governor, notwithstanding Te Teila's offer, I will not permit the sale of Waitara to the Pākehā. Waitara is in my hands. I will not give it up. I will not. I have spoken. Kingi then turned and left the hui with a large number of the people of Waitara. The meeting ended soon after. I will pause here to discuss Te Teila Manuka and why he was trying to sell the land which he knew Kingi would not allow to be sold. I think there's been a strong movement of slander against Te Teila. A number of sources describe him as being little better than a slave, but in reality he was clearly a young middling chief. He had been in the Cook Strait region with Wiramukingi and on the migration northward had captained one of the European-style longboats. Upon his arrival, his father was one of the chiefs that had discussed where people would settle on the west side of the river. He was clearly somewhat respected, although neither he nor his father were considered leading men of the hapu. Perhaps with age he may have approached this rank, although in the natural course of events he was not likely to reach the stature of Wiramukingi. So perhaps he was motivated by ambition, but the greater cause seems to have been a grievance he had with Kingi over a woman. Unfortunately, I'm a bit short on details of the dispute, simply because every version I have read has been different, and some very different. But my best guess is that before 1857, either a brother or a nephew of Te Teila was betrothed to a girl. Wiramukingi stepped in and blocked this marriage from happening. Some sources say that the girl had been betrothed young and had changed her mind as she grew older. Some say that Kingi wished to marry her to one of his relatives. Some say that she was Kingi's relative and that he thought she could do better. Regardless of the reason, Te Teila approached Kingi asking for compensation on behalf of his relative. After all, he had kept up his end of the betrothal agreement. The compensation offered was not to Te Teila's liking, and he decided that he would make trouble for Kingi. Personally, I also have a suspicion that Ihaiate Kilikumara was backing Te Teila, but there's only circumstantial evidence for this. And to give some idea of the variety of stories and possibly the slander against Te Teila, I have read versions where he kidnapped the girl a number of times, although she escaped each time. And in one story, there was never a betrothal. Te Teila was simply planning on raping the girl, and Kingi heard about his plans and told Te Teila not to. Unfortunately, I don't have any evidence to judge which of these versions is the truth, but the version I initially presented is the one that seems most likely given my limited knowledge of the people and culture of the time. But back to the events as they were unfolding. The governor had agreed to purchase Te Teila's land in person, but had also said that he would not purchase contested land. This meant that there was still uncertainty about how large an area would be sold and when it would be sold. It was in the governor's hands to decide the next step in this process. However, for the next few days he was ill and was not making decisions on the future progress of this transaction. While the governor was ill, there was a relatively well-attended public meeting of the settlers in New Plymouth. The governor was not in attendance, but the meeting was told that Donald Maclean would talk to Te Puni and try to get Te Puni to convince his son Henry Te Whare to vacate the land he occupied. The meeting then unanimously agreed to send a deputation to the governor, expressing again the need for more land, and how the slow rate of land acquisition was holding back the province. The deputation was able to meet with the governor a few days later. He reiterated that while he sympathised with the settlers, he could not coerce people into selling lands. He stated that proceeding with land sales while a portion of their owners were opposed was the surest way to lead to blackmail by some native Rob Roy on the settlers of a district. The governor also said that he would personally talk to Te Puni about his son Henry Te Whare when he was next in Wellington. Further, he would also talk to Witako and other absentee Te Atiawa about selling the land that they had been given as reserves from previous land sales. The deputation then turned to Waitara and Wiramukingi. They disliked that the governor's announcement earlier in the week had limited British law to the settled districts. In particular, Kingi's son and a number of supporters owed money to people in the town, and they were now afraid that these debts would not be collected. The other concern was whether the governor would allow Kingi to hinder land sales over the large district that Kingi had announced in February. The governor responded that he would not allow Kingi to interfere in land sales, and that he would ask Kingi to repay his son's debts. However, the governor did not meet with Kingi. He had planned for a series of meetings with Maori around New Plymouth, but these meetings did not happen, most likely due to the governor's health. However, a steady stream of letters began between the interested parties. On the 15th of March, Te Taylor and a supporter, Te Retimana, wrote to the governor reiterating the desire to sell the land. 3 days later, Donald Maclean wrote to Wilimukingi and all the people of Waitara. In this letter he reiterated that individual ownership of land was what the governor recognised. Te Taylor and Te Retimana had the absolute right to sell their individually owned land, but everyone should make clear your pieces of land which lie in the portion given up by Te Taylor to the governor. He also made it clear that the sale would happen. Te Taylor had already agreed to the sale. It was only a question of what part of the land was indisputably his individual land. Now, of course, the concept of owning land individually was not an indigenous concept to Maori society. It had really only been imposed on the society over the previous 20 years or so. Whether any person could claim to have individual title over any piece of land is highly contentious, but the government had decided this was the way things were going to work from here on out. Wilimukingi did not immediately respond to this letter, but Te Taylor wrote to the governor again on the 20th, urging speed in the transaction. Be stout-hearted and move quickly in what you intend to do. Consider also you are the beginner and the finisher of what is to be done. Before the governor left New Plymouth, he placed Robert Paris in charge of completing this transaction. However, Paris delayed proceedings. There were ongoing talks between Kingi's people and Ihaia's people, and Paris did not want a land sale to interfere in these peace talks. However, he did deliver letters to Te Taylor and Kingi stating that a sale would happen after an appropriate investigation. Te Taylor replied first by asking again for speed and that Paris not delay the investigation. Te Taylor ended his letter by reporting that Kingi had sent word to Potato, the Maori king, that he would place Waitara under the king's protection. As far as I can tell, this is false. Kingi was not a supporter of the king movement at this time. Kingi also replied to the letter. I will not agree to our bedroom being sold. I mean Waitara here. For this bed belongs to the whole of us, and do not you be in haste to give the money. Do you hearken to my word? If you give the money secretly, you will get no land for it. You may insist, but I will never agree to it. While these letters were being sent back and forth, Kingi and Te Taylor and their various supporters continued to live as neighbours, and for the most part they got along as they had before. Te Taylor lobbied people to become supporters of his land sale, and by the end of April there were 6 other people in agreement with Te Taylor. At first, the opponents of the land sale tried to use kindness to get Te Taylor to retract the sale. They went so far as to build a house each for Te Taylor and Retimana, but Te Taylor continued to push for selling the land. Paris delayed the investigation through to spring. After the talks between Ihaia and Kingi ended, he had to travel to the Waikato. After he returned, he was met by Te Taylor, who informed Paris that some of the opponents of the land sale intended to plant crops on the land that he had put up for sale, thereby demonstrating that they had claim to the land. He urged Paris to finish the sale quickly. Te Taylor spent a week with Paris, but when he returned to Waitara, Te Taylor found that his opponents had fenced off part of the land Te Taylor wanted to sell. Te Taylor tore the fence down. The people that put the fence up told Te Taylor that they would burn his father's waka, but he responded by saying that if the waka was burnt, he would burn all the houses in the pa. In the end, nothing was burnt, but it's clear that tensions were rising within Waitara. Paris finally restarted the investigation of the ownership of the land at Waitara, unfortunately without the cooperation of Wilimukingi. While this was a mystery to Paris, the reason for this can be found in a series of letters Kingi wrote to his friend, the Archdeacon Hadfield. Over the previous months, Paris had visited Waitara a number of times to get consent for Ihaia to travel to New Plymouth, and on at least one of these occasions managed to insult Kingi. It will be remembered from the previous episode that Paris had spotted an ambush that Ihaia had laid and warned Kingi. At some point, before the winter of 1859, Paris had reminded Kingi of this series of events and implied that Kingi owed Paris a debt as a result of these events. Kingi was still largely a traditional Maori leader, and the phrasing that Paris used seemed to have been interpreted in traditional terms of utu and take, that Paris felt Kingi owed him his life, and Kingi needed to do something to make their relationship balanced. To use Kingi's words, "Now his heel is lifted against me. This was his word to me. It was by me you were saved. At the present time, he and Mr. Hulse have talked about taking me because of my holding the land. For holding the ground is a very bad thing in their estimation. Hence has arisen the word of all the Pākehās that I am the worst man, but I do not know wherein I am bad." However, things were to get worse in their relationship. Perhaps in the same meeting or in a later discussion, Paris discussed the anger that the settlers felt against Kingi, and Kingi interpreted this as a threat. Mr. Paris is the Pākehā who is persisting. Great is the obstinacy of that Pākehā. Mr. Paris has also talked of my being shot with a gun and simply burying me outside in our cultivations. I am not to be taken to the graveyard. It was his plan to fetch Te Waitara. He died, and in a like manner by Mr. Paris also shall I die. That Pākehā, Mr. Paris, is glad that I should die so that he may get the land. The Te Waitara mentioned is Katatore, who Ihaya had murdered the previous year, and it is possible that Paris was a co-conspirator. It is clear that Kingi felt threatened by Paris in particular, and by Pākehā in general. To make matters worse, Ihaya was stirring things up. He had communicated to Kingi that he had been told that the Pākehā were actively planning to seize Kingi. I doubt that these plans were any more than idle talk, but Ihaya would be likely to pass on any gossip that was likely to destabilise his rival. It's also worth noting that while it is possible that Paris's insult may have been a cultural misunderstanding, he claimed that the statement about having saved Kingi was taken out of context and that he never made any insinuation that Kingi was to be arrested. A settler, James Watt, was a witness to this conversation, and a year later offered his recollection of the conversation. Kingi, friend, you are a bad man. Had you not disturbed us, it would have been finished there. Turning to Karakapā, where Ihaya had been trapped before Paris's intervention. Paris, in what am I bad, for it was by me that you were saved. Kingi, what of that? But regardless of the reason, when Paris began interviewing people to confirm the ownership of the piece of land offered for sale, Kingi did not participate in the interviews. He believed that his statement at the March meeting was sufficient to dispute the ownership of the land, but Paris and McLean consistently asserted that Kingi had not made a claim to ownership, simply that he wished to block Te Taylor from selling any land within the boundaries set out by his runanga, regardless of individual ownership of the land. While all of this was happening, settlers in nearby New Plymouth were not particularly concerned. Throughout much of the end of 1859, the local news was dominated by the Franco-Austrian War, which had actually already ended by the time the news broke in New Zealand, and their desire for land was mollified by the surveying and imminent sale of the Taranaki Block, the land that the Puketapu feud had been fought over. After the peace talks in 1859, Ihaya had been allowed to return from his exile and live in New Plymouth under British protection. He was soon joined by Te Taylor Manuka, who found his neighbours were getting increasingly unfriendly. Paris's investigations did not run for long. They started at some point in September, but by the 27th of that month he was sent a letter instructing Paris to make an immediate advance in part payment on the land referred to. There is no reason given as to why the sale of land had to go through so urgently, but my conjecture is that it is due to the imminent return of the Colonial Secretary Edward Stafford. In the last episode I read a quote from him stating that the government would not forcibly purchase land. However, at the end of 1858 he had travelled to Britain to represent New Zealand, and had been absent from the country for all the events in this episode. He had left William Richmond in charge in his absence, who was the Treasurer and Native Affairs Minister, as well as being one of the most ardent advocates of bringing the Maori people and their land under British law, or as he termed it, civilising the savages. Richmond had been present at the meeting in March where Te Taylor had offered the land at Waitara for sale, and knew of Kingi's opposition, but was driving the sale through regardless. However, in September Stafford was on his way back to New Zealand, and my guess is that Richmond wanted to have the sale settled before Stafford could block it. However, there were two caveats included in this instruction to make a payment for the land. First, indisputable title, and second, Donald McLean had to be present when the payment occurred. This effectively meant that the initial payment had to wait until November, which was the earliest McLean could arrive. Te Taylor wrote an angry letter to the governor. Hemi, Palanahi and I wish this matter to be settled at once, according to your word, and Mr. Paris must give me the payment for my ancestor, which was given to His Excellency and Mr. McLean by Te Taylor. We have heard from Europeans that the coppers have been sent, but Mr. Paris did not tell us. Is this word true? Te Taylor clearly wanted this transaction to proceed quickly, and there is an interesting sentence in this letter that clarifies why. I have spoken your word to the people, and they do not consent. Mr. Paris has been to Waitara 3 times, but William Kingi did not agree with his words. Clearly, Te Taylor was anxious about the popular resistance to the sale, and the potential for this to cause the sale to fall through. Although yet again there is no direct claim that any opponent of the sale owned any of the land that was on offer, they were simply framed as opponents rather than co-owners. Essentially, because of the governor's new system of individual title, The collective could no longer block the individual owner. Once Te Taylor had claimed ownership of the land and offered to sell it, some of the land was guaranteed to be sold. Opponents could only block the transfer of pieces of land for which they could prove to Mr. Paris that they were the owners of, by which was usually meant that they owned a structure on that land or had farmed it in the preceding years. However, the opponents of the sale weren't interested in only holding on to small portions of the land. Following the Runanga's decision in February, they wanted to retain all of it, but the governor had effectively made this impossible. This meant that come November, when the payment for the Waitara was announced, there was little that could be done. On the 25th of November, Paris rode to Waitara to announce that the advance payment would be made on the 29th. McLean had still not arrived, but Paris was coming under a lot of pressure from some local settlers, Te Taylor, and government officials. It's also worth noting that word had arrived that Stafford had made it to Australia, and this may account for the sudden reduction in requirements to proceed with the transactions. In fact, Stafford had arrived in Auckland on the 23rd, too late to delay Paris's announcement given the state of communications at the time. Kingi decided to make a last effort to block the sale, and on the 29th rode to New Plymouth along with 30 men to try and convince Paris not to hand over the money. Paris was finally able to get to Taylor and Kingi to discuss ownership of the land and to interview Kingi. The interview was short. Question: does the land belong to Te Taylor and his party? Answer: yes, the land is theirs, but I will not let them sell it. Question: why will you oppose their selling that which is their own? Answer: because I do not wish for the land to be disturbed, and although they have floated it, I will not let it go to sea. Question: show me the justice or correctness of your opposition. Answer: it is enough, Paris. Their bellies are full with the sight of the money you have promised them, but don't give it to them. If you do, I won't let you have the land, but will take it and cultivate it myself. There are a number of interesting threads to pull out of this brief exchange. Firstly, Paris did not bother asking if Kingi or anyone else also owned the land. If he had, the reply would have certainly led to a delay in the transaction. But Paris seems to have assumed that if one person or group of people owned something, that meant that other people couldn't also own it. Therefore, Te Taylor being the owner implies Kingi isn't the owner. On the other hand, it is apparent that Kingi didn't grasp the concept of individual land ownership and sales as the governor had exposed back in March. He was in most ways still a traditional Maori leader and would have been more comfortable in 1839 than 1859. Regardless, he didn't bring up the fact that Te Taylor and party weren't the only owners of the land. It's also worth mentioning that while Kingi was very traditional, he was well aware that selling the land meant permanent alienation. He described this in the metaphor, in this case as the land floating out to sea. Some of Kingi's confusion comes through in another letter he wrote to the Archdeacon Hadfield, shortly after this meeting. Father, hearken. This is to ask you to explain to me the new system of the governor. I hear of it from Mr. Paris when I went to town to stop the payment for Waitara. £100, I said to that Pākehā. Friend, keep your money away. That Pākehā said, no, I said there is no land for your money to be placed upon. Mr. Paris then said to me, it is wrong. If the governor comes, this will be the real wrong. I said, it is well, you give the wrong. Sufficient for me is the land. I also said to Mr. Paris, disputed land the governor does not desire. That Pākehā replied, that was some time ago. Now this is a new system of the governor's. From what I know, the governor is seeking a quarrel for himself, for he has fully exhibited death. I therefore ask you to explain it to me. Perhaps you have heard of the governor's new system for the present time, relative to causeless anger, insisting upon disputed land and unwarrantably paying for the disputed land which has not been surveyed. Do you hearken? I will not give the ground. If the governor strikes without a cause, then death. They said that to Te Taylor only belongs his piece of land. No, it belongs to all of us. To the orphan and to the widow belongs that piece of land. Paris took Kingi's answers to his questions as the final proof necessary for him to pay the advance payment to Te Taylor Manuka. Kingi returned to Waitara while Te Taylor stayed in New Plymouth. Although the advance payment had been made, the sale was not complete. The boundaries had to be cut, the land surveyed, and a price agreed before the final payment would be made. Paris was reluctant to press forward with this. He wrote to Donald MacLean imploring him to come to New Plymouth to finalise the sale. You may now, sir, immortalise your name in New Plymouth. Come and conclude the purchase of Taylor's, and I believe the question is then settled. However, MacLean continued to stay away from Taranaki. Despite being the government's chief land purchase officer, MacLean had not been in the province that was most in need of land since March. I suspect that MacLean was aware that the sale of Waitara would lead to problems, and that he thought it would be wise to distance himself from them. He wouldn't arrive in New Plymouth to offer his expertise until March 17th the next year. It's also worth mentioning that Colonial Secretary Edward Stafford's reactions to the events at Waitara. He was not happy about it, and went so far as to seriously consider resigning over the government's actions in his absence, but ultimately decided to remain as Colonial Secretary. There is one final event of importance that happened in December 1859. An agent of the Kingitanga briefly stopped in Waitara and secretly left a Kingitanga flag with a man named Elueti. When Wirumukingi found out about the flag, he objected strenuously to its presence, and ultimately stormed off with a number of fellow objectors. Elueti and his supporters set about preparing a flagstaff for the king's flag. Tamati Rauru, the father of Te Tele Manukau, objected to the flag, saying that he would rather die than live under the king's flag. He considered destroying the fishing nets of Elueti and his supporters, but ultimately allowed the Kingitanga's flag to be raised over Waitara, symbolically placing the land under the mana of Potato Te Wherowhero, and raising the potential for any dispute over Waitara, becoming something much greater than a war between Te Atiawa and the governor.